Over and above the exposure role that shutter speeds play in our photography, they are vital in two other ways. I've called these corrective and creative. Corrective is what we'll look at first, but even that can manifest itself in two ways. The visual problems of not selecting a fast enough shutter speed for the subject or conditions we're photographing could be caused by camera shake or movement of the subject. Let's take a look at camera shake first. Evidence of camera shake in a photograph is generally an all-over softness of everything within the image. And that's simply because it's the lens that's moving, and therefore everything in the shot is likely to be affected by that movement. If this was subject movement, some part of the image should be sharp, and it's not. Most people are aware of how difficult it can be to hold powerful binoculars still. A slight movement at our end is magnified at the point of focus, and it's no different with our photographic lenses, especially when we start to use those long telephoto lenses. In our shot here, the cause of the overall blurred image is easy to see in the settings that we used. There is no way we can handhold a 400mm telephoto lens using just a 30th of a second shutter speed. But of course, having said that, what do we do if the camera's in our hands and the bird lands for an instant within range? Well, we have to go for it, because for every 100 of these images we try, a few will come off against all the odds. So give it a try. Nothing to lose is my motto. There is a very simple and easy to remember guide that I've had in my head for more than 30 years now. It's not entirely accurate these days. Now we have lenses with image stabilization built into them, but it's still a very valuable rule. The rule says that your shutter speed should always match the focal length of the lens you're using. So if you're using a 200mm telephoto lens and hand holding your camera, you should be trying to get at least 0.02 of a second shutter speed, more if you can achieve it. So with my Canon 100 to 400mm zoom set at the 400mm end, we should have been looking at 0.04 of a second to hand hold it. As I said, image stabilization will change this guide just a little bit, but it's still valid. Here's another shot that is suffering from camera shake, and while it's not quite as bad as our bird, critical sharpness has been lost. The picture is only really now fit for the bin, which is a shame given the historical setting, the lack of tourists in the background, and quite a nice composition. So once again, 60th of a second wasn't really sufficient here for the 200mm lens that was used. Now that rule is a pretty good guide, and even in those times when we actually cannot achieve a shutter speed we would like, at least that little guide gives you an opportunity to say, I need to do something a little bit extra here to try to steady the camera. If I move on to my next image, the animal here was stable, so it's only my movement that I really have to worry about. I have a lens set at 400mm and an 800 ISO, and even then I can only achieve 125th of a second shutter speed. Well, the saving grace here was there was a fence to lean on, so I was able to brace myself into a reasonably comfortable position, and that allowed me to defy my shutter speed guide. The trick to avoid any problems in these situations is to find a comfortable and stable shooting spot, relax, and then just gently squeeze the shutter button. A stab at the button is often enough to take away critical sharpness, and when the picture should be sharp and it isn't, then we've failed. Now, having said all that, don't be too hard on yourself, because every photographer, no matter how experienced they are, will fall into this trap at times. How do you think I found these images to illustrate camera shake? So generally speaking, as we move away from telephoto lenses, the movement of us at the camera end becomes less of a problem, but still something we need to have in mind. So here I've used a 16mm lens, so a 30th of a second given the conditions is not unreasonable, and we get a sharp image with no camera shake visible. Notice too that with the 16mm lens and f5.6, I have sharpness from the LADs to infinity. And of course, with static subjects and the camera on a tripod, we are free to use any aperture shutter speed combination that we like. Here the ISO was kept low to keep noise at a minimum. The aperture was set to the sweet spot for maximum sharpness, and a 1-second shutter speed from a tripod with a cable release was no problem. Live view was also used for my glass shots, so you may want to see our video on that subject. So the other corrective problem we have to watch out for is subject movement. This is something we all experience from time to time. So when you're in a position to shoot wildlife or birds, don't shoot 10 images, shoot 100 or 200 if you can, of course. Increase your success rate using the law of averages. There's nothing wrong with that approach at all. So with this shot taken with a long telephoto lens, I have the camera on a tripod, but the issue here is subject movement. Generally speaking, subject movement can be recognized when some part of the image is sharp. In the case of this bird, that is made a bit more difficult to spot due to the shallow depth of field. But if we look at the yellow chest and the right wing of the bird, they look to be quite sharp. I was never going to be able to get the entire bird in sharp focus anyway, but the eye, head and beak was pretty critical, and a 60th of a second, as it turns out, just wasn't enough. This becomes a lot more evident when we move in and look at the bird's head a little bit closer. My ISO, with that wonderful benefit of hindsight, could have been increased to 400, which would have given me 125th of a second instead of 60th. Or I could have even gone to 800 ISO and I would have been able to achieve 250th of a second. So there's a lesson to be learned here. Rather than lose the shot, then push that ISO up if you have to. But these are the calls we make at the time. We win some and we lose some. The trick is to try to win far more than we lose. So patience is the game, and we need to shoot lots of images so we can always find some real crackers amongst those which perhaps fall a little short.